and also with Yishai Mansour from Tel Aviv University. And I guess as Nika said, the title of the talk is on the geometry of output code multi-class learning. The talk is going to be sort of broken into two parts. So since we don't all study machine learning, I'm going to sort of cover the background material, basically just sort of what are all the terms in the title. So we'll talk about what is classification learning. We'll look at sort of the difference between binary and multi-class classification. And then we're going to spend some time talking about this really popular method of multi-class learning algorithms called output code learning. And so once we've sort of covered this preliminary material, the rest of the talk is going to focus on our new results. Okay? And at a really high level, the idea of this research is to show a new perspective on these popular output code learning techniques. And so in particular, we're going to show that whenever they work well, so if they would be successful at learning, this actually implies a lot of geometric structure in the underlying problem. So there's sort of geometric relationships between the different classes that we're trying to learn. And we'll demonstrate this structure to you by showing how you can exploit it for learning in some modern machine learning settings. So if you're familiar, we're going to show how to take advantage of this additional structure to learn from unlabeled data together with a little bit of labeled examples. Okay, so the basic problem that we're interested in thinking about is the problem of classification. And so intuitively, what we would like is for the computer to take in some input object and to categorize it or group it into one of a set of predefined classes. So you could imagine doing like an animal classification task where the inputs, the objects you're trying to classify, are pictures of animals, and the corresponding classes would be, the animal's name. So people have no problem doing this, right? So there's a picture of a cat and a dog, a penguin, and a giraffe. Okay, and what we mean by learn in this setting is we want to have the computer, we want to give the computer a collection of labeled examples. So this would be like a collection of images together with a corresponding class label. And based on those examples, we want the computer to learn a general rule for mapping images to the corresponding classes. Right? So just a bit of terminology. So typically we'll call it binary classification if there's just two outcomes, and it's multi-class classification otherwise. And in general, we have a much better understanding of the binary case than for multi-class classification. And so today's talk is about sort of a specific multi-class learning algorithm. Okay, and so if we're going to say anything formal about algorithms for classification learning, we need to sort of fix a formal model for how all the sort of components of the problem should behave. And so today we're going to be talking about statistical supervised learning, which sort of takes a probabilistic approach to modeling each of these things. So we assume that there's some unknown distribution over input instances. So this is a distribution that's responsible for generating the data that our algorithm is going to see. We also assume that there's some unknown target function which maps these input instances to the corresponding class labels. So here we're using capital X to denote the space of possible inputs. So for the animal classification task, this would be like the set of images, and Y is the space of possible classes. So today's talk, Y is going to be some finite set. Okay, and given that the distribution and the target function are unknown, our goal is to try to get the computer to try to recover the target function based on example data. Okay? And the way we imagine that data being generated is we suppose that we take a large IID sample drawn from this generating distribution. So this would be like a collection of images drawn independently at random from the unknown data distribution. And then we ask someone who knows the target function to provide the labels for those examples. So in the animal classification task, I could ask any one of you, I'm sure, and you would say, look, this is a picture of a cat, this is a picture of a dog, and so on. And then these labeled examples are the input to the learning algorithm. Okay? And after the learning algorithm looks at those examples, the thing that it should output is a rule for telling us how to classify new input objects. So the output is actually a function that takes new images and outputs the corresponding class label. And sort of intuitively what we want is we want for that rule to sort of closely approximate the unknown target function. And after we've set up this probabilistic model, there's sort of a really natural way of measuring error. So we could imagine, suppose that I were to draw a new sample from the unknown distribution, I could just check whether or not h hat agreed with the target function on that example. And we could say that the error of h hat is going to be the probability that you disagree. So it's the probability that you'll make a mistake on a new example from the same underlying distribution. Okay, so this is a really well studied problem, and it's just sort of giving us like the mathematical tools that we need to talk about, classification. All right, so I sort of mentioned already, but in general, we have a much better understanding of binary classification than we do for multi-class. And so this is partly because the problem is simpler. So for example, we have simple parametric forms for binary classification rules. So if you imagine that your data comes from some Euclidean space, you could describe a decision rule with a linear separator. So just a hyperplane, points on one side belong to class 1, and points on the other side belong to class -1. We also have sort of really good VC sample complexity theory that sort of tells us how much data do you need to see before you can reliably choose a good linear separator, for example. And on top of sort of the theoretical understanding, we have really good machine learning algorithms. So we have like support vector machines and logistic regression, and just generally a good understanding of how to take a binary classification problem and produce good binary classifiers. Okay? And a lot of these ideas do generalize to the multi-class case, but sometimes it's sort of not quite as clean. Things are not quite as well understood. And so a really natural and popular approach when you have a multi-class problem is to try to reduce it to a collection of binary tasks. Because if you can do this, then you can take advantage of all of our sort of good understanding of the binary setting. And so I guess output codes are a technique for doing this kind of reduction from multi-class learning to a collection of binary tasks. But before we talk about it, maybe we can do a warm-up. So there's sort of a nice simpler reduction, which is called one versus all learning. And this is quite common. So imagine that you have this sort of toy data here. There's 3 different classes, the red circles, the blue triangles, and the green squares. And our goal is to try to sort of learn to distinguish between these classes based on their location in space. Right? And just like the name sounds, in one versus all learning, what we're going to do is we're going to learn a binary classifier for distinguishing each class from the union of the rest. Right? So for each class I, learn a predictor for, does it belong to class I or not? So there's 2 outcomes. So this is a binary classifier. And for this data here, maybe this red linear separator, it separates the red circles from everybody else. The blue separator does the same for the blue triangles and so on. Okay, so this is how you train a one versus all classifier. You just learn a binary classifier for sort of picking out each class. And then when it comes time to predict, if I give you a new example like this black question mark, you just query each of your classifiers. And if you're lucky, one of them will sort of raise its hand and say, yes, this point belongs to my class, in which case you're sort of in a good shape. But if you're unlucky, maybe more than one classifier will claim the point, or no one will claim it. And in those cases, you'll have to break ties. And usually you'll do that with some notion of confidence. Okay, and at this point, I also want to point out that so learning a linear one versus all classifier won't always work, right? So imagine that I took the classes and I laid them out collinearly with, let's say, the green squares in the middle. There's no single linear separator that will separate it from both classes on the other side. So assuming that a one versus all linear classifier would work well, is sort of imposing some geometric structure on the relationships between the classes. Okay? And so output codes, which we're going to talk about next, are sort of a natural and sort of significant generalization of this idea. So so the basic idea is we're going to just sort of change the binary questions we ask. So instead of being class I or not, we're going to be a little bit more free there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to design m different ways of sort of splitting the classes into 2 groups. And so I think the right way to think about this is that we're designing m different semantic features or true or false questions you could ask about the classes. And then the answers to those questions are going to give you sort of the partitioning. So imagine we're doing the animal classification task. You have dogs, cats, penguins, and giraffes. One question we could ask is this animal commonly a pet? Yes or no? And dogs and cats are often pets, and penguins and giraffes are not. So this gives us a partitioning of the classes into 2 groups. And you could even imagine sort of predicting whether an animal was a pet or not based on the image, right? So here are the pets. They seem to have leashes. Maybe you'd see humans with the animals. And the penguins are sort of out there in the open, and the giraffe is too big to fit in the house. So these were probably not pets, right? So you might have some belief that you could learn a binary classifier for this, answering this question. And of course, we could ask more questions, right? So does the animal have fur? Yes or no? And they all do, except for the penguin. Does it have a long neck? Yes or no? And they all don't, except for the giraffe. And similarly, like how many lives do they have? Is it 1 or 9? Right? So when you're going to go and apply an output code learning algorithm, what you do is you design this set of partitions. And to do this, you use what you know about the problem. And you'll notice that for each class here, there's a unique sequence of answers. So no 2 classes for these set of questions gives the same set of answers. So if I told you for a given animal, whether it was a pet, it had fur, a long neck, or multiple lives, you would know which one I was talking about based on the responses to those questions. Okay, so we can kind of compress that information a little bit. We can put it into this matrix here, which is usually called the code matrix. And so the rows of the code matrix correspond to the classes, and the columns correspond to these semantic features that we've designed. And there's a +1 if you answered yes, and a -1 if you answered no. And the last piece of terminology is that sort of each row, the row corresponding to a class is called its code word. And so, kind of already talked about this, but the way you're going to learn a binary or a linear, or I guess just just an output code classifier is for each of the columns of this matrix, you're going to try to learn a binary classifier that distinguishes the +1s from the -1s. So I have sort of like schematic representation of like the different classes in a problem. And this orange linear separator is kind of distinguishing the pets from the not pets. And then this one distinguishes fur from not fur, long-necked from short-necked, and based on the number of lives. So you learn one different binary classifier for each of the questions that you designed. And the result of this is you're going to get m different binary classifiers, right? And so you can kind of imagine that as being some function, h, which takes in an input instance, and it maps it to a predicted value for each of these semantic features. So that's sort of the result of doing this one versus all training. And then once you have that, the prediction is sort of the natural thing. So if I give you a new image and you'd like to predict what class is this image, first you apply your sort of predicted semantic feature function to the image. And you might say like, is it a pet? I don't see a collar. It's out in the open, so probably not. It doesn't seem to have any fur. I'm not sure if it has a neck at all, so it's definitely not a long one. And probably it has, just one life. So once we have this, then the way we do the classification is we find the row of the code matrix, or the code word that is the closest to the given semantic feature vector that you predicted. And so in this case, this perfectly matches the code word for being a penguin, and so we would predict penguins. Okay, and so sometimes people will call these output code classifiers error correcting. And the idea is that if you did a good job of designing your semantic features, you could have the property that the different code words will actually be well separated in terms of Hamming distance. And what that's going to allow you to do is even if you make a few mistakes, like maybe you're not sure if penguins have fur or feathers, the closest class will probably still be correct. So this is sort of one of the goals that people have for designing the code matrix, is to try to get the Hamming distance between the rows to be large. And in this example, it's not, because I only picked four questions, but typically you'd pick many more. Okay. So this is kind of like a quick whirlwind tour of output code learning, and it might take some time to digest it, but for the rest of the talk, there's sort of a nice, simple geometric picture of them that I want you to sort of keep in mind, and it should be sufficient for most of the reasoning that we want to do. So imagine that your instance space is this square, and you've designed this particular code matrix. So it has 4 columns, so we should expect to have 4 different linear separators, and they're linear because I'm calling it a linear output code classifier. So we could just sort of drop those down. These are 4 linear separators. And I put arrows on the side sort of indicating which side is positive. And if you look at these linear separators, they're partitioning the space into a bunch of cells, right? And the sort of characterizing property of one of these cells is that it's sort of defined by which side of every linear separator it lies on, right? So you could identify the cells with like sequences of plus and minus ones, right? And so what the code matrix is doing then is it sort of says, look, here's a map that tells you how to go from classes to cells in the space. And so it says class 1 belongs to this sort of blue region there, class 2 is over here, and class 3 is over there. So this is sort of the picture you should have in mind when you think about an output code classifier. Okay, so that's kind of like the end of the background material, so maybe it's a good time to ask if there are questions about these things. No, that's good.
What's the assumption
yeah, sure.
What exists, right? Is
Right.
it something like there's a low-dimensional projection of your space or something like that? When you write this out mathematically? Yeah,
right. So I think what you're asking is that for these things to work well, there needs to be some kind of implicit structure there, right? Like maybe the data comes from some low-dimensional, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So these methods are making strong assumptions about the problem, and we're not going to explicitly write down those conditions, but we're just going to show that sort of by assuming that these methods work well, you can just reason from that fact to get sort of other results. Does that answer your question?
These are particular projections that are good for possibly, say, humans, and there may be other projections that are good for other things.
Yes, right. That makes sense. Right. So here I guess the reason why it works well often is because humans have a good, you can use what you understand about the problem to design the particular code matrix, and then whether or not that will work for your given representation of the data will depend sort of on whether or not the feature representation is matching your sort of like geometric intuitions. And I guess, yeah, sometimes these things might not line up. But
no, but like for instance, being a pet or not is very subjective.
Oh yeah, right.
So,
Right. Yeah. So the hope is that like.
That would be a good one to learn.
Right. Yeah. So, yes. So you're trying to exploit the fact that people understand the classes that you're working on, and you want to turn that into sort of a good set of reductions. I think people will also often generate these code matrices sort of randomly. So you sort of fill in a random matrix, and then hopefully each partitioning sort of corresponds to something that happens to work well.
Or PCA or some other thing, right?
Yeah. Right. Sure. Yeah. Plausibly, you could do a lot of other kinds of ways of trying to separate. Right. Okay. So what this project is about, it's not actually about learning output code classifiers. But what we're going to do is we're going to assume that there exists a low error output code classifier with linear separators. We're going to show that when that happens, then implicitly there must be some geometric structure in the underlying problem. And the way we're going to demonstrate that to you is we're going to show how to learn from a limited amount of labeled data. So just to sort of motivate that last point. So in modern machine learning, often collecting these X's, sort of the unlabeled data, is very cheap. Right? So for an image classification task, I could write a program that just downloads pictures from the internet, and I get millions of images that way. But when it comes time to get the labels for those examples, that's going to be relatively expensive, right? Like if I have to ask a human, asking someone to do anything a million times is expensive, or maybe it involves running sort of a time-consuming experiment. And so, naturally, we'd like to have algorithms that can take advantage of having extra X's without the corresponding labels, because this is sort of matching the cost of collecting this data. And so for the rest of the talk, we're going to look at exploiting this implicit structure from the existence of a good output code classifier to take advantage of having large collections of unlabeled X's without the corresponding labels. Okay. So I think in the specific examples, this will be maybe a bit more clear. But so the first example we're going to talk about is imagine that you could learn a one versus all linear classifier on the unit ball. So here's sort of a motivating example in 2 dimensions. So I'm going to tell you that the target function is a linear one versus all classifier. So here I've drawn sort of 3 linear separators, and the 3 classes are red, yellow, and blue. And I'm also telling you that the data is uniformly distributed over those colored regions. And so this sort of looks like a strong assumption, and it kind of has 2 parts. So the first part is saying that, look, this white triangle in the middle, we're never going to see samples there. And this is maybe reasonable because these are examples that would have confused the target function. It wouldn't know how to label them. And then the second part is saying that, like, okay, over the examples that we can see, it's going to be uniform distribution. And for the most part, we can relax that a little bit, but it's mostly made to keep the calculations sort of manageable. Okay, and so my claim is that in this particular case, you can actually recover the classes from only unlabeled data. So obviously you won't know which class is which, but sort of just from looking at unlabeled examples, you can recover sort of which region corresponds to each class. And it's sort of intuitively clear just by looking at the picture, somehow these classes are well separated, right? This white triangle in the middle is like cutting them off from one another. And so the particular approach that we're going to take is based on clustering. And so the idea is, imagine taking your data and projecting it onto the surface of the circle, right? So that data is no longer uniformly distributed. You're more likely to see examples that are sort of coming from the thick central regions of the class than sort of like the pointy tips on the edges. And so if you worked out what that density function looks like, it sort of looks like this, sort of cartoon version that I've drawn. And it has 3 different modes, one corresponding to each of the classes. And the density goes all the way to 0 between the classes. So if you imagine drawing a large sample from this distribution, you'll see sort of dense collections of points near the middles of each of these classes, and it'll kind of get sparse in the middle. So intuitively, you should be able to recover the classes by doing some kind of clustering. Or alternatively, you could imagine making a histogram based on your sample, and eventually the histogram, if you see enough data, is going to sort of start to approximate this density function, and then you just need a rule for sort of deciding when to break between the different classes. So this is the approach that we're going to take, but we're going to look at it sort of slightly more generally. So we're going to assume that you're learning at least 3 classes. The reason why we don't want to allow for 2 is because then the 2 linear separators can sort of lie right against one another, and then an unlabeled sample doesn't tell you anything. We're sort of trying to guarantee that you're going to have this empty space in the middle. And it's not just in 2 dimensions. We're going to do this in d dimensions. Okay, and then our assumption that the target function is a one versus all linear classifier It's just saying that there are L different linear functions, and a point belongs to class I if and only if it's on the positive side of that linear separator. And then this last condition is just sort of restating the uniform assumption. So there's points that belong to classes and points that don't, and we should be uniform sort of over the union of the set of points that do belong to a class. Okay, so are the set of assumptions for this problem clear? Are there any questions about this? It's sort of a convenient geometric structure. But okay, so the main idea, which we've sort of already started talking about, is we're going to let Q be the density function after projecting onto the unit sphere. So in 2 dimensions, we can sort of imagine this as being like a density function of the angle, but in general, this will be a density on the surface of the sphere. And then we're going to look at the epsilon level set of this density function. And so what that is we pick some level epsilon, so it's a probability mass. And then we look at all the points on the sphere whose density is at least epsilon. And if they are, then they're in the epsilon level set. And so there's a couple of sort of geometric facts about these level sets of this projected density that are clear in 2 dimensions. And they're also true in higher dimensions. You just have to sort of write down the equation for what Q is and do some straightforward calculations. But the first one is that you're going to have L different connected components, as long as epsilon is sort of small enough that you're not skipping the classes. So in this case, so these green regions here on the bottom, this is the level set. This is the set of points that have high density. And you'll see that they sort of cover the central regions of each class, right? So you get a connected component there, a connected component here, and there's one for each class. Okay? And the sort of second fact is that these connected components have a simple geometric shape. They're sort of not complicated objects. That would be surprising because everything we put in was simple. And so it turns out that they're always spherical caps. So you can kind of imagine cutting a piece of the sphere off with the linear separator, and that's going to be what's left. Or equivalently, you could choose a point and you look at all of the points within some small angular radius. And this is sort of describing the shape of these connected components. Okay? And then the last observation is that by definition, the density is high inside of these spherical caps and low outside. This is sort of how we constructed them. And so this sort of leads us to the idea of using density-based clustering to try to recover the classes. So more or less, we want to find the connected high-density regions where what this sort of means is find the connected components of the epsilon level set. Okay, so the algorithm that we use for that problem is sort of maybe the most natural thing you would think of. And so it's sort of a simple linkage-based clustering algorithm, and it has 2 steps. So the first step, we try to throw away points that we think belong to low-density regions. And once we've done that, we try to make sure that we group together everybody that was sort of close enough. So you can kind of imagine we have this toy data set. There's 2 relatively dense clusters, right? And we think they're dense because they have a lot of neighbors nearby, connected by this sort of low-density bridge in the middle. Or you could formally think of this as being like a sample from some probability distribution which has high weight here, high weight there, and then sort of a skinny bridge that was connecting them. Okay, so the first step, which is where we try to figure out which points were high density and which points weren't, involves 2 parameters. There's an activation radius and an activation threshold. And what we do is we just draw a circle around each point of the activation radius, and we count how many samples land in that ball. And if it's less than a tau fraction of the total data, we throw the point out. And if it's bigger than a tau fraction, we keep it. And so the intuition behind this is that once you see a lot of data, if you count the fraction that lands in the given ball, this will be a good estimate of the probability mass of that ball. And so as long as your sample is sort of sufficiently large, this will give you a reliable test to see if points come from low density or high density regions. Okay? And then once that's done, now we just sort of want to connect together points that we think belong to the same connected component of the density level set. And so we're going to construct a threshold graph on the sort of surviving points. And this has 2 parameters as well. There's a connection radius and a distance metric d. And so you just make the graph where you connect 2 points if they're closer than the connection radius. And finally, you output the connected components of this graph. So the intuition was sort of straightforward. You try to throw away all the points you think come from low density regions of the space, and then do some sort of really simple natural linkage-based clustering. Okay, so when you apply this to the 1 versus all problem, here's sort of the complete algorithm. So first, we draw some unlabeled sample from the distribution, and admittedly I drew this one by hand, so it has some suspicious patterns, but that's fine. Get the idea. So the first step is we project all of that onto the surface of the circle, and you'll see you get these like dense regions where the classes were, and it sort of gets spaced out in the middle. Then we run robust linkage, and so that's going to discard a lot of these sort of isolated points, and we'll sort of get these spherical cap-looking clusters out of it. And then when it comes time to predict the class of a new example, we just project it onto the circle, and then find the closest cluster, and assign it to the same class as that. So if you only had unlabeled data, you would sort of be using dummy class names, so you wouldn't know which one was which. But maybe if you had some small set of labeled data, you could say, oh, I saw a red example in this class. It must be the red class. Okay? And so what can we say about this algorithm? So if you have some desired target error rate epsilon, so you'd like to find a classifier that has at most epsilon probability of making a mistake, then we're going to look at the epsilon level set of the projected density. And so the sort of only tricky part is figuring out how to set all the parameters. And it turns out of the parameters, the only one that's sort of hard to set is the activation radius. And geometrically, the way you want to set it is there's these gaps between the connected components. And you need to be able to comfortably fit a ball of that activation radius in there. Because if you don't, then you'll run the risk of accidentally gluing two classes together. So in this case, it's sort of geometrically clear what it has to be. And in 2 dimensions, we can show that it's enough to set it proportional to epsilon. So in the limit, as you try to make epsilon very small, its activation radius doesn't go to 0 too fast. And in higher dimensions, I kind of expect that this is true, but we don't have like a careful calculation. But so once you've done that, if you see a sample of this particular size, so it depends on the dimension of the problem, this activation radius that we picked, and the target error rate epsilon, then with high probability, the resulting classifier is going to have error at most epsilon. And so just to give you sort of a sense of where this sample complexity is coming from, it's the number of samples that we need to see to make sure that we're estimating the probability mass of these balls of the activation radius carefully, so that we can reliably throw away points that sort of don't belong to the level set and keep the ones that do. So that's sort of like the thing that's governing how much unlabeled data you need to see. The other thing I wanted to mention about this is that it's actually exponential in the dimension. So if you imagine the activation radius as being epsilon, this is like epsilon to the d squared. So it sort of scales badly with the dimension. But I guess often these things are unavoidable. It's like the curse of dimensionality. We'll talk more about that sort of in the future work. So there's another case where the existence of a good linear output code classifier allows us to learn by clustering. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't want to give you the impression that all of our algorithms are just clustering the data, because that's sort of a little bit, it's not the whole picture. But so in this case, I'm going to give you like a 2-slide version, so I apologize, this can be a bit quick. But so we're going to assume that the target function is a linear output code classifier again. And then we're going to make 2 additional assumptions about the code matrix and the hyperplanes that are sort of defining it. So first, we're going to assume that the Hamming distance between the code words is at least d+1 in a d-dimensional problem. And so if you remember from before, we wanted to make the Hamming distance large. So this is kind of like a natural condition to consider. And then assuming that the hyperplanes are in general position, what we're really trying to avoid is cases where you have a lot of hyperplanes intersecting at the same point. So in this case, at most d different hyperplanes can intersect at any given point in the space. And you can use these facts to show that there must be some gap separating the classes. So in this example, there's sort of a big gap. And the intuition why this is true is what the Hamming distance condition means is that to get from one class to another, you have to cross at least d+1 hyperplanes. And given that they're in sort of general position, that means that you can't have had a 0-length sort of line segment. So, okay, so if you were to run this sort of like single linkage algorithm with a connection radius smaller than that gap, you're never going to connect 2 different points that belong to different classes, right? So all the clusters that are output by this would be pure clusters. So sort of the way you turn this into an algorithm is you take your unlabeled set, and here I'm sort of not trying to make it look like it was uniform over that set. So there's sort of like these 3 different clusters up in the top class, maybe uniform here, and this funny sort of U shape there. So you run single linkage with a carefully chosen connection radius to make sure you're not going to glue the classes together. And then you're going to use a small amount of label data to determine the labels from the classes. And so often, there's another learning model called active learning, where you have access to some oracle that knows the target function, and you can say, please, can you give me the label of this example? And so in this case, what you would do is you'd sort of pick one example from each cluster and ask the oracle, like, what's the label of this? And since you know that each cluster is pure, that would tell you the labels of all the data points. Then, of course, to classify a new example, you just find the closest cluster, assign it to the same class. And now, we think of the label queries as being expensive because getting the labels is costly. So we need some conditions to guarantee we're not going to have too many clusters. We don't want to have to query like 1 million different points. And so we sort of look at it in 2 different cases. One of them is when the distribution is sort of uniform over those regions, like before. And we also have a requirement that those regions are sort of round in the sense that they're not really skinny, long polytopes. And we also have sort of a significantly weaker result that only requires that there's a density function for the underlying distribution, and that density function has a property that makes sure that the level sets are thick. So somehow you're ruling out densities that have these like skinny little tendril like bridges connecting its connected components. So these are just conditions that are going to guarantee us that we won't have too many clusters. But I don't want to talk more about this unless you guys have questions afterwards. Yeah? Oh, so sorry, D is the dimension of the space.
So how could the Hamming distance be more than
So the Hamming distance is the number of the different semantic features that you'll answer differently for the classes. And you could choose more of those than there were dimensions in the space. So if we go back to the code matrix here, in this case, this is true. So I have 4 different columns, so I have 4 questions, but the problem is only in 2-dimensional space. And so the Hamming distance is like between the rows of this matrix, and it's sort of wide and short. No. And so D here is not the size of the code matrix, it's the dimension of the sort of underlying space. Does that answer?
Yes.
Cool, awesome. All right, so the last sort of type of result we're going to talk about today is one where you can't actually learn by clustering the data. So it's a case where the existence of a good linear output code classifier still allows us to learn from unlabeled data, but you won't be able to do it by clustering. And so again, we'll start with this motivating example. So again, I'm just showing you the true target function, and then telling you the data distribution. So the target function is a linear output code classifier. And so it has 3 different linear separators and 4 classes. And the 4 classes are these sort of colored regions, just like before. And again, we're going to say that the data is uniform over these points that wouldn't confuse that output code classifier. And then, so the first thing is that you probably can't learn in this case by clustering, because classes 1, 2, and 3 are sort of very well connected. So you could imagine maybe doing some kind of transformation that would somehow separate them. But if you were going to do that, you would probably need to know these 2 linear separators, which we don't want to assume. So you probably can't learn by clustering. But
the assumption on the distribution on the lines?
It's always 0. So we usually assume, just to make things simple, that there's 0 mass on the lines. Yeah.
But it's a set of measures 0 also?
Right, yes.
Or you're assuming that they decay, like this is?
Yes, so we're assuming that the probability of observing an example that exactly lies on one of these linear separators is always 0.
Yeah, but it's a set of measures 0.
Right.
So the distribution is touch. So K2 is not really separable from K3. That's.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, right. So there is a measure 0 sort of cut between them. You could think.
Is or isn't? Or you're having a set of size of some epsilon?
Yeah, no.
It makes a big difference, because otherwise, clearly, K2 and K3 are the same, right?
Mm.
I mean,
other
than someone said that they're different.
Right. Sure. So just to make the calculations easy, we assume that there's 0 mass on the linear separators, and in some sense that does mean that K2 and K3 are separated, right?
But
because there's
a measure 0.
Right. So there's a measure 0 difference between.
Then you can't observe the distinction. That line can't be observed, right?
But so this is what. So we're going to show actually that you can recover it, even though there's only a measure 0 split, and it's not. The reason why it's interesting is because you can't do it by clustering, and so based on the sample of data, you're never going to sort of be able to tell the probability of one of these measure 0 sets, right? So you would have no hope of doing that. So maybe like the reason why we can still learn in this case is because if you look at this sort of empty space in the middle, we're never going to see samples there, right?
But another reasonable hypothesis, K2, and K1, 2, and 3 are the same. That's a reasonable hypothesis. Somehow we've thrown in some kind of linearity hypothesis that doesn't seem to follow.
Right. So the target function, the thing that maps points to their classes, could potentially put nearby things in different classes, right? So like it could be that all the cats, like the things that we identify as being cats, are sort of in K1, and then very close to them, there's sort of like a related species that's actually a different class. We'd like to call it a different class, but they're not separated in terms of sort of, so you can't cluster them. Does that sort of resolve?
Another reasonable hypothesis, K1, 2, and 3 are the same.
Mm-hmm. So I'm saying that they could be different for like other reasons. So they're different in particular because they occupy different parts of the space. So there is some function that differentiates between them, right? Like like this one differentiates between them, right? But sorry, I want to make sure.
Oh, go ahead. That's fine.
No. I want to make sure that like this. Yeah. So it's like you could imagine like if I just drew.
Strong hyperplane assumption.
Right. Yeah. So this ends up being, it is a strong assumption. It is a strong assumption. But it's still possible that even though classes K1, 2, and 3 all touch one another, that they're actually different classes.
I'm sorry, so here we have an assumption that we have a linear classifier for each class. Do we have any other assumptions about this distribution?
For this example, I'm just like showing you a particular one, but we're going to sort of write down an explicit condition on the code matrix that's going to
Because I guess
sort of
if
mimic
class
this.
K1 didn't exist, we have mass 0 in the upper left corner, then we would actually not be able to separate K2 or K3, right?
Yeah, so then the distribution is uniform over the colored regions here.
So whenever you have a linear classifier, so K2 has 2 times greater density than K1 or K3?
Oh, no. So this is like, each of these rectangles has some volume, right? And so the probability of observing any example in that rectangle is proportional to its volume.
Okay, so, okay.
So K2 is smaller, so it's going to have lower probability mass, but sort of,
And you cannot solve this example if K1 has volume 0.
Right, yeah, right. These would be bad cases,
Okay.
yes. Yes. Yeah, so in this case, the uniform distribution is saying that sort of the probability of observing any example is sort of the volume of its intersection with the colored space. Yes.
One last question.
Yeah, sure.
Do you assume that you know the number of classes of the classes?
Yeah, so usually we assume we know the number of classes, but not the number of columns in the good code matrix. So we know that there's like 4 classes. A lot of the algorithms, it wouldn't really be that important, but it helps sort of clean up a lot of a lot of things. Okay, so in this example, you could imagine drawing a large unlabeled data set, right? And you're going to see sort of uniformly distributed samples in each of these colored regions. But what's going to happen is there will be no points in this sort of triangular region on the inside, right? And since each of these true linear separators, right, H1, H2, and H3, they're sort of forming the faces of this triangular region, you could sort of recover them by looking for faces of like empty spaces, right? By recovering sort of linear separators that locally split data from sort of not data, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of write down a condition that maybe clarifies why or what the specific assumption is. Okay, so we're going to assume the target function is a linear epicode in d dimensions, and then intuitively we want this condition that says that each linear separator separates at least one class from some cell in the partitioning that doesn't correspond to a class and has non-zero volume, because this is the condition where sort of the data here or the absence of data is going to give you evidence that there's a linear separator passing sort of along it. And so formally, we can write this mostly as a condition on the code matrix. So what we're going to say is that for every column I of the code matrix, and remember this corresponds to a semantic feature or one of these linear separators, there exists a class, which is a row, right? So that if I flip the ijth entry of this code matrix, the resulting code word is not going to be in the code matrix, and it describes a cell that has non-zero volume. And so the way to interpret this is, if I look at the code word for class J, that's saying which cell in the partition we're looking at, and flipping the ijth bit of that code word says, give me the neighboring cell that I would get if I cross this linear separator. So this is sort of explicitly saying that, like, look, for every linear separator, there ought to be some class, so that if I cross that linear separator, I get to some sort of space that doesn't belong to any class. And then the condition that's sort of not on the code matrix is that this thing has to have, this should say non-zero volume. It shouldn't be just like a point mass or something like that. Okay, and then we're going to make sort of 2 more assumptions. One is just to make the algorithm easier to set up and to analyze. And we're going to assume that if there are multiple empty cells, or like non-class cells in the instance space, that they're separated from one another. So in the case when there's just a single non-class cell, that's sort of not a strong requirement, but it's a bit more general than that. And we're also going to assume that the data is uniformly distributed over sort of the union of these sets, K1, K2, K3, and K4, the colored regions.
So you can also cut off the upper right-hand corner of the triangle, have another classifier there, and then another class in the corner. That would be okay.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so if you had another linear separator that sort of just cut off the top corner, since those 2 sort of empty spaces that you're going to get will be separated, there's still evidence for the linear separator in the top.
Oh, but then you fill in the empty space that you get in the upper right corner with another class, right? So
Oh yeah. So in that case, it won't satisfy the condition, right? Because that particular linear separator doesn't have the property that it sort of separates some class from some empty cell.
Every separator will touch what remains of the white triangle, right? So that would be our only.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it'll touch it, but it sort of passes through its faces, right? And And so every time it's sort of at the boundary between some cell that belongs to a class and some cell that doesn't, it's sort of not the face that's defining the boundary. And so this condition actually won't be satisfied for that. Does that make sense? So like if you imagine, I guess you're sort of imagining having like a hyperplane that sort of crosses down like this.
Exactly, and another class there.
Yeah, right. Oh yeah, so if you put another class like in the corner, then it would be fine. Because now you'd use this region of the empty space to figure out H1. You'd use like the region down here to figure out H2. And then the new one would have a boundary that sort of sits here, and you could recover it from that boundary.
K2 you can also recover. Okay.
Yeah, because the thing that would cause problems is if you sort of somehow completely eliminated one of these spaces. But right.
So in that example, would you have two white cells? If you cut in the middle and then...
It depends on how you add the classes. So he was saying, you add a new linear separator that sort of crosses through here, and then you add a new class in there. So in that case, there's still just one empty cell. Yeah. Okay. So the intuition that we had was you should look for classes by finding local boundaries between places where you have data and places where you don't. And this condition is sort of guaranteeing that every linear separator will be discoverable that way.
Also, so then you can just like discover all the empty regions and take all the lines.
Yeah, right, exactly. So this is essentially how the algorithm goes. So so the idea is going to be to look for half balls that are centered on data points, so that sort of the half ball doesn't contain very many other examples. And so the intuition is that since it's centered on an example, the half ball must be centered inside of one of the classes, because we only saw points belonging to classes. But if it's mostly empty, like if there aren't very many samples in the half ball, then most of the half ball's volume should be in one of these empty cells. And so just sort of intuitively here, when you look at the picture, there's a couple candidates. All the red ones, which sort of aren't empty, they just, we would reject those. But the green ones here, their faces are pretty good approximations to the underlying linear separators. And so we're going to turn sort of this idea into an algorithm. It's expensive, but so it has two parameters: a scale, which is the radius of those half balls, and also a threshold, which is going to allow us to decide if it's full or empty. And then for each sample in our data set, we sort of imagine drawing a ball of radius r around it, and we want to find the half ball that has the fewest samples. So it's an optimization problem over directions. And you're trying to minimize sort of the number of points that land in the side. So this is a computationally hard problem. But the algorithm is already exponential time because we have an exponentially large sample, so we're not too concerned about this. If you wanted to, you could discretize the directions and sort of do a brute force search. And once you've found sort of the good half ball, if it contains less than a tau fraction of your sample, which is corresponding to having low probability mass, then you add its face to some set of candidate hyperplanes H. And if you think about it, you're going to get multiple hyperplanes that approximate each true hyperplane. But they're still going to give you a partitioning of the space, right? So there's a lot of little cells now. And the intuition is that as long as the hyperplanes that we keep are good approximations to the true hyperplanes, like the ones that actually define the target function, then there should be big cells that sort of don't get cut by our approximated ones. So what we do is we find sort of the L cells that contain the most samples, and then we just assign them the L different classes. And then if a new point comes in, if it lands in one of these regions, we say, oh, you must belong to class orange or whatever. And otherwise, you can just guess. And the probability that points don't land in these regions is going to be very small. So
their assumption about some kind of that the angles are all
right.
The right angles?
Yes.
So it's not true. If we do a linear transformation of your distribution, then I think your algorithm doesn't work.
Right. So
the go to 180 or something.
Right. So the thing we need to avoid is if one of the classes has like a point like this, where you have samples in here and there's sort of like empty space on the outside. Because in this case, there's a lot of half balls there that won't be good approximations, right? I can sort of rotate them freely.
If I just switch your example so the empty triangle gets small angles and big angles, then it's working.
Right. So the size of the half balls you have to consider depends on the orientation of these hyperplanes. And in these cases, as you sort of squish it, the size of the half ball that you're going to have to use gets smaller and smaller and smaller because you're going to sort of have to fit it in the smaller space that you have left. And this is going to drive the sample complexity up a lot. Because you're going to need to now estimate the probability mass of these really small half balls. But yeah, no, that's right. So how hard this problem is does depend on the orientation of hyperplanes. So if I give you a bad configuration where there's sort of very very steep angles, then this is going to be hard to detect. Okay, but so the analysis. So we need some way of measuring does a half ball approximate a given hyperplane. And the way we say that is we say a half ball is an alpha approximation to a hyperplane if at most alpha of its volume lies on the same size as its center. So it sounds like a mouthful, but geometrically it's kind of clear. It's like if you look at the hyperplane, it should cut off most of the half ball from its center. And so you can show that for appropriate parameters, and I'm sort of hiding this like scaling that depends on the angles. You can show that every single half ball that your algorithm is going to select will be an alpha approximation to one of the sort of true linear separators. And also, every single true linear separator will be alpha approximated by one of the half balls. So this is sort of guaranteeing that this like hyper edge detection approach is actually recovering the underlying linear separators. And you can also show that if you're in sort of a bounded domain, that once you have these sort of good approximations, they're only going to disagree with the true target function in a margin of width proportional to the root of alpha. So sort of taking these things together, if you sort of make the margin small and you know the data distribution is uniform, you can control the probability that you'll make mistakes. And so again, for any target error rate epsilon, if you see a sufficiently large sample, and so here this capital R is depending on sort of these angles, you'll output a classifier that has error at most epsilon with high probability. And so yeah, so this R is sort of like the scale parameter of the problem, which is measuring sort of how badly scaled is it.
What's M? The number of classes?
M, yeah, M is the number of linear separators here. So there's like 3 separators in this case. So M is that number. Right, so I guess I said you didn't need to know that, but the guarantees require that you have.
So essentially the number of samples you're taking is enough to draw the entire picture and have it be very nice, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So for every single ball of radius, like big R, you have enough samples that you can like really reliably estimate the probability mass of that ball. Yeah, so essentially you're sort of taking such a big sample that if you drew it, you would see the regions. Yeah.
Turning the photo would be nice and smooth, right? That's basic one.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So it would be kind of tricky if you sort of had a sparse sample. Then you might start getting sort of bad-looking hyperplanes. And so the super large sample is to avoid this problem. Yeah. Okay, so just I guess to summarize, we talked about sort of looking at this implied geometric structure that's there for output code algorithms. So in particular, when they work well, there's this geometric structure. We looked at these 3 examples. One versus all on the ball. We looked at learning linear output code classifiers with large Hamming distances, and also this sort of boundary features condition. And so things that we're sort of interested in working on going forward are we would like to identify conditions that lead to more realistic algorithms. So in this case, we have exponential size samples, and the algorithms sort of are expensive. So we'd like to see if there are better conditions that sort of allow us to avoid these things. But sort of ignoring computation, this is still showing that there is structure. So thanks a lot. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so you set up these conditions and you design these new algorithms. To me, at least, it seems like these conditions are very strong. And I guess what I'm wondering about is how current algorithms would perform under those conditions, and like kind of the motivation for why you would need to design new algorithms. So in particular, I'm thinking of like 2 things. So like, the separation conditions, it seems like, another reduction is the all pairs reduction, right? And it seems like that in this scenario, it'd be very easy to discriminate between, one class and the next and train an all pairs classifier because with high probability, choose 2 classes is going to be a huge margin.
Right.
Like you said, there's going to be a huge
Right.
space in the middle.
Right, exactly.
I
Like there's a
could
margin
easily
between.
do like an SVM, or if I want to take advantage of unlabeled data, I can do transductive SVM.
Right. Yeah.
And then just put that together.
Right.
So that would take advantage of the unlabeled data, but it would kind of be an existing algorithm.
Yeah. Right.
And I
sure.
guess the other thing is like, the condition that there exists this one this classifier that's perfectly consistent
Right.
is very restrictive because there's this paper by Daniele where he shows with high probability a random code will basically be useless. So,
Oh, okay, sure. Right.
But there are also these existing reductions like by Langford and Begelsheimer, like the filter tree, for example, is like a way that you can take binary learning and reduce multi-class learning to it.
Okay.
And a nice thing about their analysis is that it can tolerate some amount of noise.
Yeah, right.
So it seems like in particular with like the clustering reduction or clustering you set up, it's like, I also wonder, well, how would it handle noise?
Right,
So
yeah.
I kind of like would, you know, I know in your abstract there was like a, you know, under these conditions the existing algorithms don't do as well, but these algorithms do better. So I just want to maybe understand that.
Yeah, right. No, so I think these are kind of like exactly the right questions to be asking, because we do set up these sort of like just so stories and then show that you can do things. And so I think so in a lot of cases you can extend the analysis that we have like to handle, for example, cases where the error of this good output code classifier is not exactly 0.
Oh, okay.
So for example, if you assume that each time you cross a linear separator, the probability of observing those examples sort of drops. This corresponds to making like independent errors on
Random classification.
Yeah. So in some of these cases, you can still show that these methods work. So your idea is about sort of like under the same conditions, you could take the labeled examples and then learn like a support vector machine to separate like any pair, right? And I think these are the kinds of algorithms that we want to look at sort of going forward for more practical kinds of things. So the reason why we didn't do that is because to do that you need to have like labeled data, but these are like very good comments.
Because the unlabeled data thing sounds a lot like transductive SV.
Right. Yeah. Right. You're right. So in that case, you have like some labeled examples. Then you're just trying to make sure the margins are big or whatever. But yeah, I think these are the kinds of like directions we want to go forward. Thank you. Yeah.
I just want to understand what you are assuming. So you are building everything in some handling space, and then you have some separators. And you're just assuming that even though you design this, you present it as an anti. It would somehow be available to the fence and you said that certain space. I just see a huge gap between does it have per attachment to the
Right. Yeah, right. So I guess in some sense the way of interpreting what we're saying is that if you can set these like this code matrix up, which is like choosing these questions, and then it turns out that you can also learn from linear, like use a linear separator to learn each one. That is sort of a strong condition, and that's actually the structure that we're exploiting. So like that's the reason why the algorithms work, is because of these things. Yeah, right. But it won't be satisfied for like arbitrary problems.
So you could have better dependence on dimension, right? You could in a kernelized space.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You could try to do something kernelized. So you could change the representation of the space after you've picked your semantic features to hope that then they'll be like linearly separable. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Since you were talking about algorithms that weren't necessarily computationally efficient, what happens, and let's assume the simple case of a uniform distribution over some common set. What happens if you just kind of fake these examples from the region that doesn't exist? Because you can do it, you can do it. And then in a computational non-efficient way, learn an intersection of half spaces. Does this correspond to the classes that we're learning with your method as well?
So what is the proposed algorithm?
So you fake
so
there's
this empty space. You sort of just pretend like you had some. So now you have samples from this like missing cell.
And then you want to separate them, label 0, 1.
Right. So now to find the boundary between them. Yeah.
And now this is all with unlabeled data. Now you're going to get enough labeled data to hit every class, and then infer the label.
Yeah. So imagine like in the extreme case where there is just like a real linear separator there. As long as both methods sort of eventually converge to that, they'll learn the same thing. But yeah, this is an interesting idea. Like generating data from the face.
Yeah, I guess maybe even thinking whether this requires less labeled or less unlabeled or more.
Yeah, so one thing that I guess might be an issue is imagine you have two different empty cells that are sort of touching.
Yeah.
Then when you generate your unlabeled data, you sort of have to treat those as the same region or something. Like you wouldn't know which one was which. But yeah, no, that's a cool idea.
Are there any more questions? Thank you.
Thanks a lot.